Our speakers today will be Tassi and Jim Zimmerman. And I'm not going to go into great detail about their biographies or their accomplishments. There is a flyer on the table outside. You can read that for yourself. And the way things are going to work is this. First, Nina will come up and read, and then Jim will come up and read. And then because this is poetry and conversation, they've familiarized themselves with each other's work beforehand. So after they read, they will sit down and have a conversation about craft, about style, about inspiration, things of that nature. And depending upon how that conversation goes, we can certainly have some questions and answers from the audience. That's why, in fact, I have a roving mic. So without further ado, let me introduce Nina Tassi, to be followed shortly thereafter by Jim Zimmerman.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. This will be a very cozy little group, which sometime is very much more enjoyable than a large crowd. So I'm happy to be here with you. Today, I'm going to read a few poems around the theme of Journey of the Spirit. And when I think of journeys of the Spirit, I think of two kinds. First, the regular trips we all take, which sometimes turn out to have unexpected spiritual significance. And then there are the other kind, which are purely of the mind and spirit. So all these poems are about people, either real or met through literature, who have been close to my heart and whom I've tried to speak in the voices of, not so much to express my own belief as to understand theirs. The first poem takes us back to the 1600s in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. A number of Puritans came across the sea to escape persecution in England, and some of the ones who were female met with more persecution when they got here, and Anne Hutchinson was one of them. After she got here and dared to speak her mind about Scripture publicly and had a great following, the Puritan ministers and magistrates put her on trial. She was convicted, falsely in my view, as a heretic, and eventually was massacred by the Native Americans. So this one is called Anne Hutchinson in America, and it's a dialogue between Anne and her interlocutor. She never knew that playfulness was a possibility of prophecy, that she could tweak an angel's cheek, coax the light of grace from the Spirit, or say to the Lord outright, "Give me joy." Exultation was her mode. She never knew this female Daniel, while she stormed heaven for salvation, that the lion already tame licked at her feet. So much fierceness, Anne Hutchinson. Did you need to cross the sea, so fire-haired, husband, children, pots and pans in your furious wake? William kept saying to me, "Must you, Anne? Must you, my darling Anne?" Yes, I must. You know I must. I knew every minute that the bread of adversity and the water of affliction were soon to come upon me. And my beloved Will, fortunately, he worshiped me and the children of our flesh. I could devote myself to my revelations. They really couldn't stand her loud mouth in Boston, so unseemly for a Christian woman to match words of Elizabethan wit in Meeting House. Such a sorry little place, Boston, with its scrubby cows and hogs at rut, and puffed-up ministers strutting about in the mud. Wasn't it a muddy wilderness indeed, an improbable place for a fierce female prophet to arise and take her stand? I did not look upon the meanness of the place, nor did it discourage me. In fact, I found it bracing. Cold sea, barren shore, wild grasses blowing. You welcomed it, the stripping of your mind's cloth, the crown of thorns sunk by those dark Puritans into the tangled mass of your burning hair? Yes, I had the word of the Lord, I am the same God who delivered Daniel out of the lion's den. I will also deliver thee. I stared savagery in the face long before my throat was slit. I refer to Boston's severe-eyed, gravelly-voiced, bow-legged excuses for men of God. And when you were slaughtered by the natives, did you forgive those magistrates and ministers, your eyes fixed on the crucifix of Christ? I had no thought of them, for the Lord, as he promised, sent Daniel to take me by the hand and raise me up, singing exaltations to glory everlasting. You don't have to clap after each one. Save the wild applause, I think, for the end. The next piece is also about discord and hatred in America, and it takes us up closer to our own days, the 1960s. And the African-American civil rights leader, Malcolm X, led a very tragic life of violence and was even jailed. And eventually, though, before he was gunned down by enemies in Harlem, he took a long trip to Mecca and came back a transformed man, preaching love and acceptance to all races and creeds. This he only had a few months to do before he was gunned down. So this poem coming up is a lament for the 6 daughters he left behind, and a memorial to the grief journey they then had to follow in their father's footsteps. And it takes me back to ancient days where evil always existed of this kind. 6 daughters. Before Israel, there was Egypt. The winds blew across the Nubian desert, blew and hissed until the earth blackened. The sleepy waters of the Nile were roiled, and the yellowish-green flow thickened and slowed, and out of the turbid slime, snakes were stirred up, sleek green serpents risen high, hissing with glistening tongues, glistening coils risen from the alluvium. The women singing continual dirges faced the hissing of the snakes, while 6 motherless daughters stood apart from the others, feet bare on parched earth, arms dangling, heads covered and bowed, shadows absent in noon sun, eyes unseeing, they whispered their dirges. Atala, beloved child first in grace, Kubala, Elasia, Gamila, delivered in faith, Malika and Malak, newborn twins, unfathered in womb. Mother, winds tore through their laments. Protect us, shield us, raise up your body, uncoil us. Monsoons came from the north and passed away again. Hear me, daughters, hear me beneath the whirring winds. Wait for me, daughters. I am swimming toward you across the Red Sea, arms shouldering the water, ants stinging my eyes. I come to you, daughters. Listen, you shall not be pressed down. You shall withstand snares, coils, and vexations. You shall not be pressed down. In summer, when the southwest monsoon blows, I shall reach you as surely as all the rivers run into the sea. You will not be pressed down. I, a stranger, will be mother to you all. The next one comes following a trip a few years ago that I took to China for a study tour in Beijing, and then our group took a long trip across to the western part of China, and we wound up in this sleepy little border town where I had this experience. It's called Tibetan Boy. At the far edge of China, we meet on a patch of barren earth. I, weak-kneed, woozy in the hot sun. He, a boy of 14 or so, in jeans and denim jacket too big for his slight build. His face, Tibetan. He talks matter-of-factly, the way a son talks, as we stand together on rocky shale, muddy river flowing lazily behind us, its stone bridge gracefully arched toward his forbidden home. Exiled half a century before his birth, he flees time and again to Tibet and returns to this ramshackle village to be beaten and jailed by police thugs for violating rigid Chinese law. His thin bones seem made of shards, delicately pieced together. He's bird-like, not like devouring predators with fierce beaks that pluck out eyes, threaten the boy with death, but a small, dark, secret bird with soft wings who travels by night under the gaze of silent Himalayas. He alights in the dark on a rocky ledge, thrilled by the smoky air of his homeland. Tibet's ancient days flow in his blood, fill his bursting lungs and veins, dazzle his eyes with swirling reds and golds as incense-bearing Dalai Lamas sway in procession through the ages, offering brief comfort till he must go. Caught anew by his oppressors, he refuses to kowtow, takes their blows, his bone-shaken jaws bloodied and sore. Yet he will fly again, tireless migratory bird, to spend a moment in his homeland, for defiance, for freedom, for courage, for nourishment. He recognizes his true home in ravaged, suffering, captive Tibet, in the folded hands of monks, in the faces of old women, in his footprints on his own soil, in the rocky path he risks in the dead of night. Now, in bright sunlight, I put my arm around his shoulder, feel a quiver as our wings brush against each other, saying, survival is not enough. The spirit must be free to feel its weight, to know its strength, to hope, to fly, to trust, to live. He smiles shyly, as a grown son might, takes my hand, and together we soar high over the wild white Himalayas. A few years ago, I took a trip to the other end of the earth, sort of on a lark, where a few friends were looking to form a fourth for a section of the ship. And it turned out to be Antarctica, which I didn't really know at the time was south or north. That's how ignorant I was. But it was a transformative experience. And this is one of the poems I wrote, which are the fruit of some meditations that took place there. Woman on Antarctica. Dark blue water, white cresting waves, milky foam soft in its rhythms. I have reached the far shore for which I have always yearned, and leave the sea to its mode of stillness. Sunlight stretches over blinding snow, voices of my companions recede. A few penguins putter about. The light grows cool, its stark whiteness, layers fall away. This immense continent of ice is familiar in its very strangeness, as a man's strangeness is known to me, his secrets hidden within a cave where he seeks the inevitable. I have faithfully plowed the fields, heart yoked and bent, hewing to a path laid open by pity and love. I have known the colors of desolation, black cindered earth and its ashes, muddy earth's paralyzing mire, blood-red rivers of grief. Yet I have listened in ecstasy to the flow of underground streams, felt cycles of the moon playing over me, rhythms answered within my woman's body. At the center of the earth, the flux of things seems stilled, and over me there surges a pleasure rarely felt, of emptiness at my core, a shedding, a release, then a slow expansion to fullness of being. I rest in the paradox. Now, having fallen in love as I did with Antarctica, when I got back home, I researched its earlier past, the great age of explorers at the turn of the 20th century, where there was a big race to get to the South Pole, and a number of expeditions went out and suffered arduous turmoil and sacrifice to get there. And this is a little memorial to the team that made it there first, which was Captain Roald Amundsen, a Norwegian. He got there shortly before Scott. So this is called The Little Tent, December 17th, 1911. Beneath a brooding gray sky, at a tiny point on the vast ice plain, their leave-taking begins. The 5 conquerors, men in furs with ice-ravaged faces, hoist the little tent on a pole, secure it with guy ropes all around, then tightly lash a second pole to it, 13 feet high at the top, where they fly the Norwegian flag. Then stand, heads uncovered, to watch unfurled silk crack and wave in the wind. One by one, each man stoops to enter the little tent, a homely gem of ingenuity fashioned by one of the men out of a kilogram of gabardine, a marker to withstand Antarctica's worst. Alone in the dark interior, each man writes his name on a tablet. Amundsen seals a letter for the king and a note to Captain Scott, expecting he will soon arrive with his men. They lace up the tent door, hitch the dogs to the sledges, and start the homeward trek. The forerunner sets a brisk pace as the men with lightened sledges urge the huskies forward. Left behind at the pole, the little tent remains, humble monument to lofty achievement. Many times the men turn their heads for a last look at the receding tent until the white air swallows their view. Strange home it made for a brief moment, the sound of a tent door flapping in the wind, bright flash of love glimpsed in comrades' eyes, then gone, a mere speck in a lonely universe. My next to last poem concerns a journey that men and women who fall deeply in love take, many over a course of many years. And this poem is about one of those brief moments in time when it seems to capture the entire essence of their love. And it's called The Sky is a Silk Mantle. It's set on a Cancun beach on a beautiful day. Sky, a vast expanse of glorious blue, centered by the sun, sending forth a million brilliant tiny points down to the sand and sea. No cloud breaks the sweep of sky, sea hushed by intensity of blue, world held in abeyance, light envelops us. Sky floats down, a silk mantle wraps loosely about my shoulders, makes me beautiful for you. I glory in your gaze. Your eyes welcome the sky, you invite the sun to dazzle us, and you say, I will never leave you. God's breath full of play seems near. Sky, an immense spreading mantle of blue gossamer, showing a way beyond billions of galaxies toward eternal light. My last poem is also about love and grief and the memory of such wonderful moments. It's called Return to Skelliger Castle. And I should tell you that Skelliger Castle is a big tourist castle in northern Italy on a high cliff overlooking Lake Garda. And it was once fortifications that go all the way back to the Lombards. And now it's exclusively a tourist site. So this is my last reading for you. Return to Skelliger Castle. I had no memory of being here till at the doorway to Goethe's room, I saw the two of us 20 years ago lingering over a display of sketches Goethe once made of Skelliger Castle. We had forever, it seemed, to think about ancient Lombards building this fortress, boulder by boulder, on a high cliff where centuries of bloody wars were waged. Now these massive gray stone walls glisten as if diamonds were set within. Flowers abound in pots on the ramparts. Tall cypresses reach serenely for the sky. Newlyweds skip down a long staircase from the terrace where they were just married. As their laughter fills the air, I think, if I climb these stairs, he'll be there, waiting, our years together not ended. I step onto a balcony over Lake Garda, born of glaciers, shimmering far below. Mountains millions of years old slumber on. Leaving the castle, I meander through arches, one after another, built to withstand time. Love overtakes me, more powerful than stone. Thank you.
I think we should give Nina another hand. That was beautiful. And I'd also like to really thank Gregory Tague for having put this together and to introduce me to Nina's poetry. And we've had some dialogue about it, and I guess we're going to afterwards talk about it a little bit more about our experience as writers. I will be reading from this book, Little Miracles, and the narrative arc of the book is essentially the early poems in the book are about the sort of discomfort and unfamiliarity with things in life, with experiences that we don't really understand, and just that kind of unease when we come upon aspects of life that are not really comprehensible. And then it moves into poems about death and mourning, and the disorientation that death and mourning create in us, and then the disorientation, the sense of our own mortality, and the constraints of existence, what we are as mortal human beings. And then finally, toward the end of the book, there are poems that move more toward transcendence, toward acceptance, and hopefully toward a sense of inner peace. The first poem is called The Near Edge. The lane is here, clearly unmarked, save for the froth of morning doves and red-winged blackbirds that betrays the way to the algaic pond that certainly must lie beyond the insanity of brambles, cattails, and fruited vines of deadly nightshade at its mouth. I think perhaps I should follow the path of infrequent puddles on the lane, drawn by the plaintive voices of tree frogs beckoning in the mist. But I am blind to it, cannot heed the call, not the kind of man to find myself standing accidentally in someone else's private hidden close. So I return to the sturdy pavement of the main road, perusing picket fences lined up along the way like little children ready for the first day of school. But the cattails will not let me turn away. The tree frogs call me back. And I find myself again at the near edge of the street, weaving muted songs of what awaits me there, beyond what I dare to hear, beyond what my eyes can see. The second poem was actually inspired by a situation where somebody thought that they recognized me and I had never seen them before, although I have a little problem with facial recognition, so it's possible I had seen them before but didn't know it or didn't remember. So it was that form of discomfort. It's called nice weather. I didn't recognize you, she says, as I climb out of the car thinking, how can I explain I don't recognize myself anymore either? And the mirror of lines in my hands reflects nothing but the perplexity at how things came to this point. And I feel I have to tell her, her tan face, hopeful gray eyes, and neck like an old faux crocodile pocketbook, that I have never seen her before, never met her, so she should not concern herself at not recognizing me, but at thinking she saw me before I didn't recognize myself. And so, turning away, I say, nice weather we're having, so nice to see you again. And this next one is about birthdays. As we get older, birthdays are not as much fun, right? When we were kids, they were great and it was exciting and everything. And of course, probably disappointing because you didn't get the right presents. But as you get older, it's another one. So this is called Dry Season. Today it was or is my birthday, or so they say, so I forget how to sing. My voice a searing arroyo in the Mojave dry season. And I forget my first foray out of the salt ocean of amniotic soup is the reason why people might stop on the street and shake my hand or shake me awake, singing like dolphins or gray whales, scaling green walls of sound, to celebrate my presence on earth or commemorate the time when enough of me was formed enough to be willing to come out and gulp the dry air. This next one is going to be accompanied by the multimedia part of the program. I'm going to hand these out. And one of the best ways, one of the most wonderful ways of seeing the passage of time is to carve avocado pits. You take the pit and however you want to carve it, whether you open it and carve the inside or carve the outside, they transform before your eyes. And then over a period of time, they turn into these little weird things that I'm passing around. But it definitely gets you a clear sense of the passage of time. This poem is called Carving Avocado Pits. Time passes, not in ticks or years, but in tears and aches, fears and breaks of rhythm, insistent little wrinkles like the tracks of a crow near the eyes or a slack at the corners of the mouth. Its progress so relentless in the flourishing of veins on the back of stippled hands and in the stiffening of fingers. And so it comes to this. Every careful cut I make with toothpick or a tiny blade takes hold in the yellowing flesh and speaks its name in gold, auburn, or brown over, what else to call it, time. And every face that comes alive on the map of a die-cut seed turns wizened in indignity, contorted in pain or confusion, the gashes and contusions more darkly strange over time. Look at them. The first lurks in a ramshackle gaslit alleyway. See which one that was? The second sports Rasputin's leer under wild and flaming brow. And a third greets me with the sweet, boozy befuddlement of a briny old hen. But there is quiet resignation in reddening eyes and a spot of spittle drying on shriveled lips. And in time and time again, in the crucible of my hands, the prideful fire in each one fades to a mirthful smirk, an inside joke, or the shards of a broken nest after fledgling birds have flown. And this next poem is about the sort of disorientation and the kind of unearthly feeling that happens when someone close to you dies. And you know the world seems the same, but the world has changed unutterably. It's called 4 Days After the Solstice. I missed you today in the long minutes of waning light. I wanted to show you how ill at ease the sparrows felt on drooping branches of the Japanese maple, and how the squirrels did not choose to revel in their usual manic chasings of the tail. They were more timid and small today. I wanted to tell you that the red-capped flicker kept her counsel in uneasy silence, letting blind grubs go free in the dying bark of the white oak. I wanted to say that we all knew about glistening blue feathers hidden in the dripping grass, arrayed like a spray of bellflowers, left behind by the careless jaws of the black cat. And this next one, if I can find it here. I've had the experience a number of times of knowing when someone died, at the moment that they died, but from many miles away. And it's a very uncomfortable experience, as you can imagine. But having had it happen and then get confirmed later on that that was the moment when the person died. And one of the ways I try to understand it is in terms of what Albert Einstein called spooky action at a distance, or what they now call quantum entanglement, where one electron, and they've actually demonstrated it scientifically recently, that one electron can be made to move in a certain way, and another one at a long distance moves exactly with it, okay? So there's something going on that we absolutely do not understand. And on the macro level, I sort of figure that in relation to what has happened to me under those circumstances when someone dies. This one's called Synchronicity. When I thought what you thought I thought it first, but perhaps it burst from both of us together. Like honeybees who know at once when to swarm and where the best flowers grow without buzzing cell phones or nimble texting. Like paper wasps who build a nest in their own perfect effigy, no CAD-CAM to guide their way. And starlings, flocks of glinting dots, fluid cumulus silhouette, channeling Georges Seurat. Like the simultaneity of Newton and Leibniz birthing calculus, Darwin and Wallace evolving, or Jane Doe and John on separate PDAs dreaming of the same plate of pesto-laced linguine. When photons dance in rhythm despite long miles between them, which one follows dutifully? Which one leads the way? When a coral reef sings Circe's song to hovering angelfish, do they hear a single lithe soprano or a fabric ringed in raw cacophony? And when I knew your life was over, hundreds of miles away, did you know it first? Was it born within your eyes, or was I there to warn you? And this is another one about sort of, I don't know how many of you do this, but when I read about somebody, famous writer, composer, politician, some of which we wish were already dead, I sort of figure out how old they were when they died. I kind of look at their birth year, death year, and sort of, anyway, and then think about it in comparison to myself and to people I know. This is called relativity. I wonder why, when I think of anyone now, I try to figure out how many years they've been on Earth, or how old they were when they left. And I think about how old they were when I was born, or how old I was when they were, and what the year was in the time when I thought of them at such and such an age. And I think of Bach at 65, or Plath, or Thomas, Mozart, or John Wilkes Booth, Mantle, or Ruth, or my father's father. By the time they were my age, they were all already dead. And I wonder, did they all have a belly like a pear, or hips like an eggplant, when they had lived as long as I have? And if their memory had begun to slide and waddle like a penguin on a sunlit ice floe? I know somewhere there is a rumpled picture of my father at my age with a background sunset, the color of anemic blood, not quite red enough to be blood red, looking over at me across a hedge or a span of years with tears at the edge of his eyes, wondering what I am thinking of a man as old and reflective as he is, looking back at me, looking back at him. And this next poem is inspired by the concept of the multiverse. That is, that we are not the only universe, that there are other universes next door, nearby, perhaps right here. Who the hell knows? It's hard to determine how to understand that. And it's also about the experience in meditation of finding myself in a very different place. It's called side trip. I seek an occasional side trip to the universe next door, the next slice in the cosmic loaf of bread. There, crows do not say caw, nor sneezes achoo. It is unearthly still. No language to ruin thought, no heavenly bodies to memorize the words. And there, God is a magic wand to a violin, an open hand to a hungry dog, or perhaps to a lurking trout, an angler's passing fly. And I have two more poems to read. The first one is a speculation about what death is, and also some of it is kind of the knowledge of what I assume will happen. And the knowledge part of this poem is in parentheses. So when I go like this, it means that phrase is in parentheses, okay? I don't know how else to convey that. And this is almost like a call and response between the sort of speculation and the other sort of kind of slap in the face reality piece of it. It's called Meditation on the Thought of Dying. And if there will be pain, there will be pain. I will seek a cool serenity sitting by its side. And I will hold its crushing weight in the crevices of my hands like the journey of white sand returning to the sea. And if there will be cold, there will be cold. I will take its hoary breath into my emptying heart, and I will find myself just close enough to listen to the flow of frozen rivers, the song of sinuous breezes, the cosmographic pulse of a moonless winter night. And when there will be death, there will be death. I will wait for it to greet me with a blinding golden light, an endless mirrored hallway, a ripening field of hay, a leafless, deepening forest. And if there will be blackness, there will be blackness. I will breathe it in forever, and I will lie upon a bed of open sky. And the last poem, and actually before I finish, once again, I'd like to thank Gregory Tague for putting this together, and Nina for reading such beautiful poems. This is kind of, it's about a wave. And in the ocean, when there's a wave, and I was recently at the ocean, and I can tell you that waves hit you, okay? But waves don't really go like this. Waves go like this. Each molecule in the wave stays in the same place and bobs up and down, but it kicks the next ones, and they all go that way. It's kind of like, if you think about in at a baseball game when everybody's doing the wave, well, you're not running around the whole stadium going like this, right? You're just in one place, but the wave goes around. And I conceptualize that as something about what we are like as beings, that we are separate, but we're also inevitably woven into a larger whole that includes all of us. This is actually a haiku, and it's called "We Are the Moment." We are the moment when the wave begins to curve, ocean reaching up. Thank you very much.
So maybe you could, as poets, tell us what your reactions were to each other's writings in terms of subjects, themes, those kinds of things, style, poetics.
Okay, do you want to start, Jim, or you want me to? You prefer I do? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think our work is very different, but we have some similar overlapping subjects. So I was particularly noting those, one of which is nature and creatures of nature, and another one, death. And I thought you seemed to handle things from a much more close-up perspective, and I tend to look at it more from a distance, I think. And I was entertained especially with the thoughts, the little random thoughts we all get that I would never think of turning into a poem, and yet you do, very successfully.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's striking how different our styles are, and yet I agree how much overlap there is, and also in a sort of sense of sort of grasping for what is beyond, right? And trying to reach for understanding of what life is beyond, what life is about beyond what we can understand, and beyond. I mean, my experience of writing, and I don't know if you have this as well, is that part of what poetry is about is an attempt to describe in words something that's beyond words. Do you also feel that way? Yeah. I think one of the differences in general between our writing styles is that I tend to, at least in this book anyway, write with a real economy of language, and yours is more narrative. And that makes for a different feel, at least on the surface of it, but certainly not in the core of it.
Yeah, I think it's amazing how many things you do without even realizing you're doing it. And one night, the priest who runs the poetry group, I'm a member of at Lincoln Center, said, "All your poems seem to be about people." And I thought, oh, gee, are they? You know, I never thought of writing a poem about a person. It's just that that's the way it happened. And also, I think my poems kind of combine the dramatic and the lyrical. And I think that's a little different from the usual lyric poet who tends to write shorter pieces. And even though I keep cutting them back and back, they're always longer than I wish they were, but they are what they are.
But they work.
Well,
I mean, they certainly do have a narrative arc to them. Yeah. One of the things that I really like about writing poetry, I don't know if you have this experience also, is discovering what I've said after I said it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so, like, I was noticing, even as I was reading these poems, there's a lot of internal rhyme and assonance and alliteration. And when I'm writing the poems, I'm not meaning to do that. It just kind of occurs. And then I look back at it and say, oh, that's what I wrote. Yeah. And sometimes even, oh, that's what I meant, right?
Well, I think a lot of poems come out of a desire to express something that's just on the edge of consciousness, and you're trying to grasp it. And that's one of the things that's a challenge about poetry. You know, it's always just beyond where you would like to get. And so it's never perfect, but you're always trying anew to make it perfect. And then, as you said, Jim, what often happens is where you thought you were going is not where you end up at all. I remember reading once Stanley Kunitz, the poet, when he was asked, how he did he says, I go where the poem goes.
Yeah.
So you start out with one idea, and then as you go along, another one entirely may develop.
Sort of like, oh, look what I found. Right.
And
I asked where poems begin. Do they begin with a thought or an experience? Ninas seem to be looking back at experiences, but I wonder, I guess it's probably a combination of things, but whereas yours seem to be more immediate, or something that occurs at a daily moment, or a thought that comes to mind and you sit down and express it. But I don't know, maybe that's wrong entirely. Where do you begin? Is the question.
because she was pretty accurate.
Yeah, Nina just said you were pretty accurate about her. and you're pretty accurate about me, too. What tends to happen to me is I will take a moment that occurs to me and work from there. And yes, so it's very immediate, and it tends to be grounded in the concrete, even though, as you probably noticed, sometimes it goes way off into the Mojave Desert, for example. I don't know how I got there. But it almost starts with the sense perception. Yeah. Or an image, or sometimes it's a memory also, though. Yeah. But it's very much concrete. That's where it starts.
I already know Nina's poems very well. Indeed, I'm Daniela Gioseffi, who wrote the little review in your program. And I'm a poet myself, and we feel the ascension of the poet's spirit as she moves through time and around the globe to meet varied believers and cultures. So I think that's very much the narration in Nina's poems. What interested me so much about James Zimmerman's poems is his use of physics, which fascinate me too. You can often find me at the Hayden Planetarium looking at the billions of supernovas. So I knew what you were referring to in physics, this entanglement, which is so fascinating, and this idea of multiple universes or multi-universes. And I wonder if you've studied physics, and because it seems evident in your poems.
Go ahead, take it.
No, I did not study physics, but I have read a fair amount of that kind of stuff, and I'm fascinated by it. I'm also fascinated by the mind. I'm also a psychologist. And in fact, I was thinking before when we were talking about where does poetry come from, that one of the things that research is finding, in fact, my brother-in-law does research on creativity with functional MRI, which is, you get an MRI machine, but you can actually do stuff while you're there. And what he's discovered in several creative pursuits, including music, narrative, freestyle rapping, poetry, something else, is that there are essentially two phases of the process, and any of us who do some creative pursuit will recognize this, I think, right away. One of which is the inspirational phase, and the other of which is the editing phase. And in the inspirational phase, the areas of the brain that we associate with the CEO of the brain, that is the top-down thinking, the control of processes, shuts down. And so the brain in the creative phase tends to light up more like the brain lights up when we're dreaming. And my experience when I'm writing poetry is like I'm in a dream. And that's part of why I'm so compelled by writing poetry. And in fact, music too. I'm also a musician. And similar kind of thing if I'm just improvising or something like that. So that connects back to physics in a different way. It connects back to neurophysics. But yeah, it's... I'm fascinated by all that kind of stuff.
Or Nina, did you want to talk about where your poetry comes from?
Well, I recognize the two sides of the brain that get involved in, and my problem, because I come from academia and taught English literature and creative writing for years, is that I have a hard time letting go of the controller to let the more creative imagination loose, as it were. And I also tend to start editing and winnowing down before I've gotten the full flow of the poem out. So I'm always working to get that balance right, because you have to have both. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Sorry. I think my guess is that there are some people who are born with more of a tendency in the direction of being able to kind of let that happen. But I also think it is an educable process. And actually, we referred to meditation before. I think meditation is a process that can help you get to where you can release that more. Or I should say, let go of the thinking, I don't know what we want. I hate using the term ego because it has such loading. But the reasoning side, the conceptualizing side, the sort of linear side, right? So I'd say yes to both. Yeah.
I could add to that is that I think the great creative geniuses in music, art, literature, and you see what they created before the age of 25 or 30. I mean, they had to be born that way. You know, I think that maybe the amount of gift, as it were, that a given person has may be greater or less and require greater or less work. But, you know, when you think of a Mozart or Keats or any one of those great poets, they had to have been given a special gift. Yeah, heavy genetic load.
Did you guys want to talk a little about the process of your craft? I mean, do things come spontaneously and then you don't do much revision, or do things come in little increments and then you add to them later? I mean, how does it work?
Well, I guess every poet talks about a gift, and that's where a poem just drops down from heaven almost finished. That rarely
really
happens
wish
to
for
me.
those, don't you?
The more regularly I write poetry, the more I tend to get little inspirational signals. Like the one I read, Tibetan Boy, that was based on an actual experience I had in China. And I think I was there like in 2005. And all I had of that experience was a little photograph of the Tibetan boy standing next to me. And I don't have any other photographs or anything else. But anyway, one day when I was doing nothing particular, I got this little line in my head that said, he flew with my spirit and I flew with his. And I thought, who the heck is this we're talking about here? And by a process of elimination, I remembered back to that young boy and went back and rooted around, found the photograph, and that's how that poem started. But Alicia Ostreicher, a very well-known poet in New York, said, I don't find my poems, they find me, and then I'm haunted until I finish them, which I think is a very good
That is a good way of putting it, and that's what I look for, because when there's one that sort of finds me, a lot of times I'll let it sort of percolate around, but I don't want to think about it until I'm ready to really try to write it down. Although sometimes I'll write a whole poem while I'm trying to go to sleep or in the middle of the night. So as far as the process of it, I think for me it varies a lot, but it needs to have a hook. It needs to have something that gets it started. And often for me, to get a poem written, I have to figure out the first line, even if I don't know where it's going. But I need to have some way to kind of get that process rolling. But then often I will just let that line or couple of lines lurk around in my brain for a number of days and then write it down. And as far as editing, some of the poems come out almost just the way they are, and others I will hammer away at like crazy. And as my wife knows in particular, I'll obsess about whether "and" belongs there, or "the." And it makes a difference, it really does. And so sometimes it's to that level of granularity, and sometimes it's really much broader.
And of course, again, with my propensity for editing and being an academic, sometimes I will work so hard. I always have at the end of my worksheet what I call discarded lines, where when I'm pretty sure I'm done, that one isn't going to work, I put it in there. And then maybe I've worked a week off and on a poem, and I go back and I look at the discarded lines and I say, oh my gosh, I took the best ones out.
So you write another poem.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to do just the right amount of editing and not to remove the juice, as I like to say.
One technique I learned early on when I was first writing poetry from many mentors was to read the poem aloud after I finished it, so that it would, as Shakespeare says, go trippingly off the tongue, and then you can really hear if the music works or if the words are too awkward or too much of a mouthful. I wonder if either of you use that technique of reading it aloud for the music after you've written it.
Well, I'm always saying it in my head, and I think I'm almost as good as in picturing from my head how it sounds as when I actually read it. But it's true that if you're having difficulty with the line and you say it aloud over and over again, you can sometimes see where the problem is.
Well, and for me, reading it aloud is crucial. Yeah. But often, once it's almost done, sometimes along the way, because I am a musician and was a songwriter also, there's a lot of music in my poems. But sometimes I want them to be awkward. And I don't know if you noticed that in any of these, but because as a psychologist, I know that the way the brain is likely to receive the information is that if it goes like this a couple of times, it's going to make you feel uncomfortable. And if I want a poem to make you feel uncomfortable, that's going to be in it. Okay? So then if I read something like that and it doesn't feel right, that's okay. In fact, that may be exactly what I want. You know, so it depends a lot on the poem also.
Yes, people that hear poetry and they're not used to reading it or hearing it will often say, oh, gee, there's no rhyme anymore, because they're used from school to having the end rhyme. But all the rhyme now in contemporary poetry is within the lines and and also working from line to line. And and people would say free verse, oh, well, you can just put down whatever you want. No, free verse, I think in a certain sense, is harder than going with traditional meter and rhyme, which is sort of like a package that's given to you that you have to fill in as prescribed. With the free verse, you've got to create a rhythm and a structure sort of as you go along the way, but it's far from free. Right.